to our session today on quiet quitting. Let's get started by introducing the incredible panel that we have today. And do we want to start with Rachel, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to say hello to everyone. Hi, I'm Rachel from Here of Living Better. I work with organizations who are experiencing turnover and issues around retention.
Okay, and Jessica?
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Jessica Lambrecht with the Rise Journey. At Rise, we work with small and growing teams, usually under about 200 employees, and help them build out everything workplace culture through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And Kimone?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimone Napier. I'm the founder of Higher Breakthrough, and we help startup companies and business owners to really put the right people in the right seats at their companies.
And finally, Ashley.
Hi guys, I'm Ashley Reed. I'm a former marketing exec and transformational teacher and coach, and I work with high performers and high achievers on their career and personal journeys.
Awesome. And so today, let me make myself smaller so you can see this. So today we're going to be talking about quiet quitting, and you may have heard of it or read about it recently. And in the US, the roots of it come from TikTok. But it actually started on a Chinese search engine called Baidu in April of 2021 from a former factory employer who had been unemployed for 2 years. In the soul searching that he did in that time, he wrote a manifesto, which was essentially inviting people to take control of their own lives by choosing to lie flat. 1 year later, and this same trend started to spread through TikTok, thanks to a user called Zed Leplin. And here we are today with quiet quitting being the latest buzzword in human resources. So let's jump right in. And what is quiet quitting? What are the signs? What are the behaviors? And what are the motivations? Rachel, do you want to start for us?
Yeah, one thing that I hear in my network and is a misunderstanding of quiet quitting as somebody who is not doing their job. Quiet quitting is really doing what we're being asked at our job and not going above and beyond. So it's really, putting a stop to the hustle culture. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't even know from their boss what success looks like in their role. So quiet quitting can be very common in those cases.
Thank you. And Kimone, do you want to add to that for us?
Yeah, everything that Rachel said, it really is, an employee, somebody in a job that is literally fulfilling the duties of that quote unquote job, which means that they're also not necessarily going above and beyond by maybe working overtime and sort of things because they are trying to have work and life balance. I think that's the main component that I see missing for a lot of people is that they think, like Rachel had suggested and had mentioned, that they think that quiet quitting means that somebody is just like not doing their job. But because we have been used and taught, in society to just work, and we don't necessarily focus on work-life balance, it's seen as a thing that is like completely far-fetched and is not normal when in fact that is the way it really should be.
Now, who is quiet quitting? Is this a generational thing? There's some evidence that suggests that it may be more common around young people, especially since it blew up on TikTok. But then Gallup suggests that actually 50% of the workforce it can be defined as a quiet quitter. Is there an identikit for a quiet quitter, and what would they have in common? Ashley, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I think, what Kimone was saying before is part of the issue if we think about it. We're using the language quiet quitting for something that isn't actually about people quitting their job. So it's obvious to see why there is confusion around the topic in general. And I think when I look at it, I don't think there's a specific profile, but I think the people that are moving forward with quiet quitting are part of this movement in general have similar, and I think the biggest one is burnout, which we've already touched on this call. I think there was this sort of perfect storm of burnout and then a lot of extra space that we don't normally have because of COVID, which can create extra time for reflection. And so I think most people are just having that moment of, okay, I am overworking. There is no work-life balance. I'm ready to scale back. So I think it's more about the characteristics that they're or places they're in being similar, but the profile in terms of industry, age, I've seen it vary across all of those.
Thanks. Jessica, do you want to add on to that? Oh, I think you're on mute. Jessica? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to be
Zoom
so
moment.
conscientious with being on mute. My dog is going wild over here. Ashley, I think everything that you said is spot on. That it's not necessarily a specific profile so much as groups that might be more susceptible to being disillusioned, being disrespected in the workplace, and also thinking, we look at everything through a cultural norm. So that's kind of where my head immediately goes: is what are those practices and processes that are in place to help folks understand what was said earlier around, I think Rachel said, really understanding what success looks like. So how are folks being positioned for success? How do they even know what that is? And a lot of that comes down to just the structures that are in place at work. I do want to also note something that I brought this topic back to our team. We are a very collaborative team, and I wanted to make sure that we got everyone's voices in the conversation. And one of my colleagues, Ayana, pointed out that this is something that historically marginalized communities have been experiencing and living with for a very long time. A lot of this is a lack of communication, a lack of psychological safety, also, tied into very, very closely into burnout. But really looking at where those cultural norms, those behaviors might be leading people to just disengage from work.
Okay, that's really interesting. So here's the question that I ask, right? Is this an employee's revenge or is it their right? And this is sort of the manifesto. This is the TikTok guy that started the trend, if you will. And he actually updated his videos to say that actually the terminology was wrong. And this is one of the conversations that I have with most of the people that I work with, is that quiet quitting is really, really bad branding. And he talks about, again, the Chinese version, the lying flat, the work to rule, meeting expectations, boundary setting. And he says, you're not outright quitting your job, but quitting the idea of going above and beyond. You're still performing your duties, but you're no longer subscribing to the hustle culture mentally that work has to be your life. Now, this is interesting because if you go into a store and you pay for something and there's the price on the label, you try it on, you purchase it, there is no expectation on either party's side that something more is due. Why do you think this is in the workplace? Whoever wants to answer first, go ahead and throw a hand and I'll put you on screen. Kimone, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the main reason that this has become such a thing, I think it's one, misinterpretation, like people not really understanding the actual meaning behind quiet quitting. I also think it's that, again, we have been taught and trained just from honestly the very start that it's work, 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 no pleasure, no fun whatsoever. And a lot of companies really has that type of workforce in place in their companies. It's sad to say, but that's the honest truth. And then to Jessica's point, with marginalized community and particularly as a Black woman, and to give you statistics with it, a lot of people are going above and beyond with the intention that I need to work, 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 and work harder in order to get a promotion or a raise. And we know from statistics show that often people are looked over for positions. They companies and they might go outside of their actual internal workforce in order to actually promote somebody, which is just going to lead to burnout. One, because this person is working above and beyond and they're not reaping the rewards. So again, rather than being in hustle culture, work, work, work all the time, it's literally employees and people really taking a step back to see, like, okay, maybe I need to implement some boundary setting, advocate for myself, and do what I was actually hired to do.
Jessica, I saw you nodding. Did you want to add there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how the conversation is framed. Both sides, the employer side and the employee side, are both kind of owning the term in their own way, but it is centered around the employer, right? So somehow these employees are quitting. They're not getting the above and the beyond, right? So it's like they're not getting their money's worth, even though with your example, Erica, I mean, they're getting exactly what they paid for, right? So I think taking that, centering that around the employee and maybe switching to an intention, assuming a positive intention, like, hey, why are they checking out? Why is there no curiosity around this with the, coming from an employer side? Like, it seems to just be like, oh, we're at a loss, our team isn't performing above and beyond. What do the employees need to do in order to show up the way that we want them to, as opposed to just feel like the alignment and the incentives are just off. And I think it really needs kind of a reevaluation. And I think you just showed a slide of kind of using different language. And I think that is a huge part of like reframing this conversation in a more productive way.
For sure. Did anyone else want to chime in? Ashley, Rachel? Ashley, coming to you.
Yeah, and I think I love it. First of all, the rebrand, spot on. Like I was saying, as a former marketer, it's confusing from the onset. And I think we've touched on this some. I think what becomes so important is the reward structure currently in place is set up in a way that it not just accepts, but it encourages this overachieving and this doing more than your job role. So when you're hired, you have your job role, but you have this extra 20, 40, sometimes 100% from my experience that's expected, but is an unwritten rule. And so there's this ambiguity that we've come to accept as a norm. And so as people are trying to take some of their life back and just operate within the structure that is supposed to be their role, the reward structure and the expectations aren't aligned. Because I know in a lot of companies, if I would have just scaled back to my role, I wouldn't have been promoted. I wouldn't have moved forward. So I think we need to look at the challenge of also when these shifts happen, employees can't be penalized for just doing their job. There has to be a shift in that reward structure that aligns with the new system as well.
Rachel?
Yeah, I wanted to add, I thought it was pretty fascinating that original TikTok creator kind of came back and said he's not quiet quitting anymore because there have been layoffs in his office. And so he's concerned about whether or not he would be on the list for layoffs. I feel like sometimes there's an aligned reward structure, right? But every company has its own sort of like unspoken rules when it comes to why you need to go above and beyond. And sometimes it's not even going above and beyond. Sometimes it's why you need to toe the line of whoever your manager is, even if, I worked with somebody in the past who going above and beyond felt very threatening for this individual. And so I was kind of encouraged to quiet quit. Otherwise, my role was unsafe. What I'm seeing now is sort of a tension point between companies of like, you should be so happy to have a job. You should be already feel so rewarded that we even decide to give you a paycheck. And that's why you should be on, more than the 8 hours that we expect from you. And coming from my perspective as somebody who spends a lot of time with psychology, I find that really baffling because you don't want people to feel like they have to go above and beyond and be in this state of nervous activation. Because when someone is having sort of anxiety or frustration or confusion about work, you're not going to get a really engaged worker. And when you were talking about the metrics of how we can look at quiet quitting from a statistical analysis point of view, I believe that what Gallup has been doing is looking at disengagement numbers around work and looking at those disengaged workers as the ones who are quiet quitting, which may be true, but I think it's a little bit of an unfair assessment because I think the two things might have different answers for disengagement versus different answers for managers who want to manage their people to be more motivated to try new things, take on new roles, really go towards a path.
Yeah, and I definitely think that they did put everyone into sort of a big giant pot, right? Who are putting in people who are disengaged, people who are feeling a little marginalized, people who are feeling burnt out, as well as people who are quiet quitting. Now, talking about the expectation that everyone overperforms, this came from a BBC article, and it says and they actually talk about something really interesting historically speaking, that first of all, the breakdown in unions, right, means that there's every man for themselves. And there was one of the studies talking about in the Hawthorne studies that they noticed that when one person did do above and beyond, the rest of the people on the team would correct that person because they were going to ruin it for everyone else. So it used to be that there was an alignment of the employees, and then of course it shifted somewhere along the way, I'm assuming with conditioning of rewards and promotions and stuff like that, where if you're the one who goes above and beyond, eventually this will be yours, whether it's true or not. And so Kate Bailey, who's a professor of work and employment at King's College, says workers are expected to be engaged, enthusiastic, and motivated. They should be putting in extra hours and effort in order to get noticed or promoted. These expectations are now so embedded and internalized by workers that many fear if they don't go above and beyond, they'll at best never get promoted, and at worst, they'll be labeled slackers. And the other day I was doing a podcast with this woman, and she said that she loved her job. She had a very specific job that she was good at. She loved her job. She did not want to be a manager. She did not want to be promoted. She did not want to do anything other than the job that she was doing. And so she felt sort of an oppression, if you will, to have to go above and beyond. Now, I remember when I was running a team, it's hard to have everyone who is upwardly mobile because you can't promote everyone at the same pace. So someone to me who loves doing their job and loves to do it well, that would seem like a gift. Why do we think employers are so offended at the idea that some people might want to step back and just do what they're supposed to? Kimone, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think again it comes to what has been embedded in our culture. This is what we know. So it's like this has been set as a standard for years. And it's almost seen as that if somebody is not operating within what we considered somebody to be quote unquote doing their job, when in fact what employers mean is by overperforming, they're seen as a quiet quitter, which is why that terminology has such a negative connotation. And if we're going back to really looking at things deeper, like statistically wise, if we're looking at, let's say, women, right? According to the Department of Labor, when we're looking at women amongst all races, the majority of the workforce is made up of Black women, which means Black women are looking for jobs. They are in a lot of jobs. So if we have to really look at it from that lens, and we're looking at it from the perspective of our workforce, what it means is that we have this big community that's been working and overperforming, right? And then when it comes down to getting promotions, getting raises, which is what we are taught to do in order to get noticed, in order to move up the career trajectory, and that is not quote unquote happening. And then they take a step back to say, like, okay, let me just take a beat, do my actual job for a moment. It has a negative connotation. And I think where it also comes back to is that employers, they need to really consider the engagement amongst their workers, all of their workers, because once somebody is actually engaged, once somebody actually wants to be at work, they have work-life balance, they'll naturally go above and beyond. They'll take more initiative. So if we look at it from that lens, I would say a lot of companies and employers really should be looking at their workforce and how they can change things internally to make it a more effective and a safer place for their workers.
So commenting that kind of quiet quitting is a symptom, not necessarily the problem.
Exactly. Yep.
Ashley, let's go to you for a comment.
Yeah, I agree with what Kimone is saying. And then I think there's another big driver here in terms of the reaction that companies and managers are having that's based in fear. Like we've said, this is the norm. It's been the norm for a while in terms of overperforming and that expectation of overperformance. And so when someone comes in and starts to change that, sort of like we saw in that first example, when people were first showing up and trying to overperform, there's fear because it's not the norm. It's not the accepted. And anytime we create change, it creates reflection. We have to look at ourselves. So if someone else is starting to slow down and create more work-life balance, that's a mirror for the people around them to say, like, oh my gosh, am I working too hard? Am I living my life right? Do I have changes I have to make? And a lot of people don't want to ask themselves that question. So I think there becomes this fear, and the fear around change that also plays into the system when we have been accepting something for so long and someone starts to come in and look at it differently and try to show up differently.
Yes, the class. Oh, sorry, Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, if we all step back and kind of like think about the workplaces we've worked in, and we also think about the people we know in maybe senior leadership roles, right? I see it worked for me, so you need to do it this way too. And I find it fascinating, particularly that Gen Z is pushing back on this, because what I can see is as companies continue to contract their workforce, a lot of companies are forced to do layoffs right now or restructuring. There are fewer management roles, and so that idea of sort of like this it works in growth of some businesses. We will exponentially grow, but you can't exponentially grow your leadership opportunities. And so I think companies really have to step back and say, just because it worked this way for me and I'm in this senior role, leaders need to step back and ask this question: what does this look like for someone where there actually is not a role open for them? It may not be that people have been passed over for promotions because promotions have been happening. It may be they've been passed over for promotions because there's been one opportunity for a promotion and there have been 25 people who honestly deserve to be promoted. If you look at the consulting industry, it's an up or out mentality. You can move up in leadership in the big consulting firms, or you get placed to the client in a senior role. There isn't that model for other companies outside of consulting. So we really have to be asking, how can we keep people engaged and seeing opportunity if we don't have endless money to pay for higher salaries, and we don't have endless even senior roles to put them in? Do others here see that tension point? I think there's too many people saying it worked this way for me and so you should do it too, but it's not working that way for everyone else anymore.
Jessica, did you want to comment?
Yeah, it's interesting, Rachel, it's a really good point, right? So we only have so many upward pathways, right? Like there's only so many managers an organization can have. But the expectation for everyone is to excel, right? That's what's kind of embedded into our norms, as Kimone pointed out as well. Like this is kind of what we have internalized, is that we have to the above and the beyond and the going, attaining and initiative. But where do we go? And I think there's an opportunity, again, Rachel, as you kind of started to wander into this, but what does recognition and reward look like if it's not a promotion? Is it compensation based? Is it increase in responsibilities? Is it visibility? Is it new opportunities for learning and development and career, growth? What does it look like to support someone when, and as it's been mentioned, like if you're managing a team, you don't want every single person looking to just climb the ladder. You need people that are present and engaged in the work that they are presently doing. But there has to be a way to keep the incentives in alignment and keep motivation, moving. But we're not structured that way currently. We really need to look at how we're engaging people where they are and creating the incentives that keep them motivated in that place.
Yeah, that's a great point there. And actually, one of the things I want to talk about here is knowing the high cost of burnout and stress, right? There's so much, even before COVID, we were able to account for the increase in costs from productivity and loss issues related to stress, as well as increase in turnover from unhappy employees. This article here, the research is clear, long hours backfire for people and companies, is from 2015. So none of this is like 2022 Eureka information. We know that it's counterintuitive to push people. Research also found that productivity per hour declines when people work more than 50 hours a week. After 55 hours, productivity drops so much that putting in any more hours is pointless. And those who work 70 hours a week only get the same amount of work done as those who put in 55. We also know on the flip side that the quality of work improves when we feel a better sense of work-life balance. And Jessica, this kind of goes into what you were saying about, like, maybe there's different ways that we reward people for excellence. There's also other research that says that managers can't tell the difference in work quality from someone who worked 80 hours from someone who worked less. So given that and we've kind of discussed this, but I'll just kind of circle back to it with a different shade. Knowing what we know, why are we so hung up on these unfounded ideas? What are we afraid of? Jessica, do you want to start here?
So the first thing that comes to mind is maybe a bit off color, but I think about something that we hear from clients every so often, which is the switch to remote work is troublesome. And this kind of ties into like the hours. It's the optics. It's the optics of people showing up at 7 a.m. and logging out, leaving the office at 7 p.m. and what that commitment literally looks like. I've had someone say to me, we really want butts in seats. What are people doing while their butts are in the seats, right? Like, are they productive? Are they engaged with their work? Are they, producing great deliverables? Like, maybe.
Yeah. And, it's funny because when I first started out in my career in advertising, 800,000 years ago, we had a job where if you left at 7 o'clock, they would look at you weird. And so even if, like, we were all staff assistants, even if we had done everything, right, and there was even the proactive work done, we would sit there in the office and play cards because there was an expectation of FaceTime. But at the same token, we were like getting, it didn't make us want to work harder for them because we were like, we could be out enjoying our lives. This is, nonsense. What steps can we take to make a shift out of this? Rachel?
Yeah, I want to put a pin in one point because yes, individuals are responsible for their own personal happiness. There are steps that we can take as individuals to decide when we need to disengage from work. That's definitely a thing. And I also want to point out that we are obviously also impacted by the systems we're working within, right? So what I think is hidden in this chart on burnout and in the conversations on burnout that I'm hearing often is the people who are burning out are the people who are picking up the pieces when someone leaves. Right. So when I was speaking about, like, where are the opportunities? There are not endless leadership opportunities for people to move up to. There are not endless pay raises to get within a company. They're leaving the companies. That's what it continues to fuel the Great Resignation, which is not slowing down. I hear from executives every single day. I was just hearing from one banking executive this morning in a LinkedIn message, and I said, how's turnover going in your team? She said, turnover is not an issue, but we cannot hire for the roles that we have open. So, I mean, we really have to remember, and, I know that leaders have a lot of things on their mind, but if you have an open role in your team, someone is picking up that slack. And those people are burning out, and those people are more likely to, even make mistakes with the work, not follow up with a customer in time, all of these things that can really impact your bottom line and really impact their own sense of personal wellness and well-being. So, I think we need to be really careful and, looking, and we all are problem solvers here. I'm somebody who's always tinkering around with my own life and my own habits. And so I want to be thinking about, like, how can I minimize and maximize and do all of these things. But we can't forget to look at the system as well and how we are impacted by the systems that we work within. You kind of have to, if you're a manager or somebody working in leadership at a company, you need to be looking at addressing both sides of this, providing individual interventions and tools that people can use, reminding them that those tools are there when they're very stressed, and looking at how can we make sure as a system we are doing as much as we can to minimize harm, and particularly harm from those open roles.
That's a super interesting point. And moving into something that you had mentioned before, so this came from a Quartz article last week, which says in her latest column, Ito caught up with Justin 6 months later. Now, Justin is the TikToker who did the first video about quiet quitting, and found that the vibes had shifted. Some of his colleagues were laid off, and he worried he could be next in a declining economy. Today, Justin, the OG quiet quitter, is going back to going above and beyond, Ito writes. He's working 50 hours a week. Do we think that companies, employers will ultimately have the last word? Ashley, do you want to take this?
Sure. And I think, it's a combination of last word and also what we were talking about in terms of all of the great data out there that's showing and has been showing for a long time how unhealthy this approach is. We have this 30,000 foot view versus the real-time short-term demand and pace within a company. So we can know it's not good for us, but if we show up to the office and we have something that should take 6 months that we have to have done by the end of the day, we're automatically going to go back into that burnout mode and overworking. So I think there's a misalignment there. We've talked about other misalignments, but I think there's a misalignment in terms of knowing the data, but not being able to implement it if the short-term strategy and approach to the work is a cadence that doesn't allow that. And I think that becomes part of the upper hand conversation. It's tough because there's that cadence that even quiet quitting, if the project is under you, it's under you regardless of the time frame. So that pace speeds up even if you're still just doing your role. So the upper hand is there potentially because there's a fear. I mean, if everyone doesn't join into the movement, the outliers are the ones that are usually under the microscope. So if within his company it makes sense, he put a bit of a spotlight on himself. I love what he did, but still, that's going to be the person that gets noticed. So if other people don't jump in, the power shift, I think, does go back to the company because people are going to be noticed if they're just doing their job and role. So I think there's a combination. We've talked about this. There are a lot of structural imbalances and systemic challenges with the dynamic right now that is all playing into it in a different way.
Kimone, do you want to add on?
Yeah, certainly. I agree with Ashley. I think it's a combination. So I don't think employees will necessarily just have, the final and only say when it comes to this situation. I think it will be a balance because this idea of quiet quitting, in quote unquote, is responsibility on both parts. Employees have to like manage work-life balance, one, yes, but they also need to advocate for themselves and set boundaries. On the flip side, employees need to have an open line of communication with those employees because the way we work, our workforce is shifting. All of the data suggests that, which is why, sometimes I feel so bad for Gen Z to get a bad rap because everybody's like, well, this is a Gen Z, issue. I do think, the shifts in society, life has become very difficult for a lot of people. With COVID, we're dealing with inflation, all of these things where life is very stressful for most. And I think it affects, because the people who are your employees are people too. So I think both parties are affected, but I think what's going to need to happen is that there's going to need to be active changes in the way we work and our expectations. So like, for example, like Rachel had mentioned earlier, usually it's the lower level workers or people who are more entry level in terms of their career who are suffering because of the pandemic, because of the layoffs and stuff. So normally they're the first to go. And with that being said, is that we also need to be looking at, the way we're compensating our workers. What is the compensation structures? What is your awards program in your company? Because as Rachel had pointed out with systems, those are systems as well. So you need to be really looking at your organizational structure. You got to look at your compensation structures. You got to look at the way you're rewarding people. And you also need to make plans and implement plans, look at your data and see how you can have a more engaged workforce, because that's going to support you in the future of work, because we are in the beginning stages of that.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting what you were saying, also because there's some research that says that when employees, have a clear idea of the career paths available within the organization, like if I do this, then this will happen, then this will happen, that kind of certainty that comes with that data allows them to work better. And when they're in organizations where it's just like, maybe, if you do enough, maybe it'll happen, that is actually a source of stress. And one of the ways that you can deal with a better relationship, psychological safety with your team is to publish, this role requires this and these skills and these abilities, communication abilities, relationship abilities. And that allows the person not only to be engaged, but also to know where they need to upskill themselves. And we'll be talking about this in 1 second. I do want to go to this, because this is one of my favorite little pieces of data here, is that will the employers have the last word, or will the Surgeon General? Now, last week, the Surgeon General released a warning about that abusive or cutthroat workplaces may be harmful to human health, and laid out a roadmap detailing how employers can shift their workplace culture and practices to better protect people's mental and physical health. The link between our work and health has become even more evident, Murthy said. More and more workers are worried about making ends meet, dealing with chronic stress, and struggling to balance the demands of both work and personal lives. Now, I bring this up specifically because this has been something that I've been kind of researching for a while. In 1964, the Surgeon General issued its first warning about the risk of tobacco and smoking. And in 1994, a watershed fine from the Surgeon General that covered retroactive damage came down. There's also been a few cases, one in recent decades, where the employee was able to establish that the workplace was harmful to their health, to their mental health, and won monetary settlements from their employer. So it's not unthinkable that in the near future, there will be government fines that monitor what goes on in the workplace. And in my opinion, it's simply a question of when more than a question of if. And employers who don't take steps today to address these issues may actually find themselves on the losing end of litigation. Which brings us to, I know what's going to be your guys' favorite question, and I think the most helpful to everyone. What steps can we take to solve this? Who wants to go first? Okay, Rachel.
Yeah, I think it's a really critical time for employers to get a leadership team together and to really decide what is important, which actions and key performance indicators are important for moving their business into the next phase. That next phase might just be keeping their business stable during what's a very unstable time with the economy, or they might be looking at growth. Some companies are still growing and still have opportunity. But I think a lot of companies have really lost sight of what are those key activities that need to be done in order to move the business forward, and how are they going to measure them? And I think once you can answer those questions, it's clear which jobs are critical to answer those different needs within an organization. From there, I think, once you know how your teams are structured, then really we need to be engaging with our employees on a one-to-one basis more often. There is a process called the stay interview process, which is a weekly touch base that a manager has with each report that they work with. And it is not that report updating them on projects. It is an expected meeting with expected questions in the meeting that really don't change, that touch base with, what do you need from me as your manager in order to get the most done this week? Making sure that that employee has enough psychological safety to expect this meeting and to know that they can ask for things in this meeting. The other side of that is the manager needs to be able to actually either find those resources or get an answer back to the employee about why that isn't possible at this time, but that their feedback is important. So I think, the stay interview process is something that costs literally nothing for employees and employers other than the time needed. You don't need a new tech stack. You don't need a complicated consultant to come in. There are many articles and books on this process, but it is the single most effective way to keep your employees engaged and also to know that they have the tools that they need in order to get those jobs done that are critical for business growth.
Fantastic. Jessica?
I love how simple this question is. The solution. So, one thing that we, when I work with teams, one thing that's always really important right at the start is just to stop. Everyone take a deep breath. These jargon and these terms, and you see it on every headline, and it's, every HBR article, and it's here, there, and everywhere. And I think just kind of taking a deep breath and just, hey, all right, we're gonna think about this, and we're gonna, move forward intentionally and carefully. So pausing, back to kind of what I said at the top, not making assumptions about intent. Maybe just assuming right off the bat, like, this is valid. This is a valid concern from our employees, and we need to listen and hear from them. And identify where those gaps are between what we can be doing better. I think there's always going to be a learning from that. I don't think we ever see that, what the employer thought was going on is in fact exactly what is going on. There's always information to be learned. So I think any solution is going to start with just stopping. Start with stopping. Maybe that should be a tagline. Start with stopping and then listen. Listen and learn. I think every organization has the skill set, to Rachel's point, like, you don't need to do anything fancy. Every organization has what they need to make adjustments to create a better workplace. It's just identifying what actions they actually need to take.
Great. Kimone?
Yeah, not so simple, but not so simple question. I agree with both Rachel. I agree with Jessica. Because I do think that, everybody needs to just take a step back and really, sit for a minute and really think about what makes sense. And I think there's things that employers can do, and I think there's things that employees can quote unquote do. From the employer positioning, I think when we think about engagement and burnout in those topics, because they come up so often, usually the solution from just an HR point of view, they'll conduct, engagement surveys. They'll have annual surveys, which is great. But when you have that data, what is it that you're doing with the data? And I think employers miss the mark on that point, because it's like, yes, you have the information, but now you need to take this information and do something with it to kind of change the trajectory. From a recruitment standpoint too, it also starts from the hiring process, believe it or not. Because even from me, when I'm looking at, the jobs out there and things that, people that I work with send me, that hustle culture is embedded, believe it or not, in those actual jobs. And I think we need to really change that. They'll use language like we talked about, going above and beyond, or entrepreneurial spirit, and which quote unquote means, do more, always constantly take initiative. And I think we need to really look at things from a work and life balance perspective. And of course, like managers and leadership, again, making sure you have an open line of communication with the people that work with you, which goes to the employee side, which making sure you're advocating for yourself, but you have a space and time, as to like Rachel's point, where you can advocate and have experience in it. And then other things that I think employees could do is definitely set some boundaries for themselves. This quiet quitting thing, it doesn't have to be you quiet quit, right? Every day, or you're going above and beyond every day. Maybe it's, one day a week, you're like, this is the day where I have the most energy and I could take more initiative. So making sure you're setting boundaries for yourself. And I think if we approach it from both angles, that way we'll definitely be able to come to a really customized solution.
Great. And Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record. I agree with what everyone has said. I think for me, the key becomes that pause and identifying where the ambiguity is and removing it. And that's both with the current workforce and when it comes to hiring new workforce and new employees. Because I would always say to my team, ambiguity is the devil. I would joke with them and say that within the business environment, having ambiguity leaves you so much exposure, leaves so much risk, and it leaves a lot of confusion, which none of those things are what you want in your business model. So it becomes important to pause and say, okay, what are our exact expectations? Discuss that with the employees, make sure everyone is fully aligned. And then as you start to hire, try to move away from this idea of here's what's on paper, but we're going to expect much more of you when you come in. So I think that systemic shift needs to happen. And then I really agree with Kimone as well. I think it's setting your own boundaries. Even when I was working in organizations like Amazon as an executive, I made sure I set my boundaries to protect myself. Now I still worked, quite a bit. That didn't free me from the expectations. But when I took the role, I said that I would be taking all of my vacation days because that was important to me. And that was how I kept my health and I performed well at work. So I think there are ways that we can still do our job. And if that means overperforming it sometimes right now while that structure's in place, we can still protect ourselves in ways that create some balance and boundaries in the meantime, while those bigger system changes still need to happen.
Great. And so moving on to our last question, actually, we've talked about the role of the organization, and we've touched a little bit on the role of the manager. This is from Gallup, the same article, and it says it's quite clear, glad that Gallup has it very clearly, that quiet quitting is a symptom of poor management. So they say that the first thing that you need to do is address manager engagement, because only 1 in 3 managers are engaged at work, and then that the managers need to be re-skilled to win in the new hybrid environment. And this actually is a point that comes out in almost every conversation that I have with colleagues, with employees, with employers, is that very rarely has the organization taken the time and the investing the resources to properly upskill their managers. What can managers, what role can they play in healing this quiet quitting? I don't know who wants to start here. I'll go back to Ashley first, since you.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I find this one interesting. I think managers are easy to blame. I'm not saying there isn't some truth in this in terms of culpability, and there definitely is a need. I think if you think about it in general, when I started managing people in my career, there was never a time where I was sat down and taught how to manage. So it's one of those things that grows with you as you progress and become an executive, but you're not necessarily always trained on the best way to do it. So in challenging situations like we're in right now, I think that training and that support becomes even more important and valuable in terms of helping people navigate. But I also think there's a little bit of what is the culture? What are the managers doing? What's the C-suite doing? Because we can try to create change at a mid-level, but if we're trying to create change at a mid-level and there's pressure coming down that's anti that change, we're going to still be running into challenges. So I think it gets dangerous, again, to look at something from a very narrow lens and identify one layer that could be the challenge. We have to zoom out and look at it from 30,000 feet again and say, where else could there be challenges or pressure that's keeping this system in place and that's keeping these challenges recurring?
Kimone, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Ashley said, because I think managers are often quick to get the bad rap when it comes to things like this, when in fact it is like a 360-degree wheel. It's the circle, because yes, managers play an important role, but we have the C-suite, we have our directors and executives and things of that nature. So I think what really needs to happen in terms of the manager is focusing on rebuilding relationships between management and, more entry level workers, I think that would be a really good start. Because they, at that level, you definitely are going to want to promote psychological safety with the people that you're managing, because, like to Ashley's point, no, there's rarely in certain organizations that you get into a management role and they have an actual management training program, or there's resources available, to help you manage someone, which I think again is an area that needs to be focused on, because it's like you're throwing somebody to the wolves. It's like, okay, now manage these people, when in fact there's nothing provided. So I think also with leadership, who people who have moved up the chain and who have experienced management people, they need to also be supporting these managers, in order to manage people effectively. Last thing that I would really share with the manager, I think also making sure that they're collecting feedback. They're really having a listening ear to what the people who they are managing are saying, because they can in fact take that information back to leadership to try to implement some changes. Managers cannot do it on their own, nor should they. So I think it definitely needs to be more open communication, cause and effect between, C-suite managers and of course the more entry level workers.
Great. Jessica? I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'm getting so much better at the mute button. So I couldn't agree more with Ashley. It is totally unfair to put the burden of this on managers. They are already, for the most part, doing everything. They are managing up, they are managing down. They are the principal drivers of change in any organization, specifically and especially in small and scaling organizations. That is like team members, when things are moving quickly, when organizations are particularly agile, they look to their direct manager, and that person is handling everything. So adding anything else to them or putting any blame on them can feel very easy, but is not always ultimately very impactful. And as Ashley mentioned, this starts at the top. But there are things that managers can do. And like Kimone said, they can't do it on their own, but there are some things that they can do and kind of work around the systems that they might not be able to formally change. And I think we've touched on almost all of it, but, really checking in with your team, understanding what individuals' bandwidth and capacity is, asking questions. Another, I think, really helpful thing that has also already been mentioned, but is giving that timely and constructive feedback. Again, ambiguity is just, across the board is a huge predictor here. And so anything you can do to reduce that, kind of walk that back a little bit, will be really helpful. So when you can, get off of a call and immediately go and speak one-on-one to someone and explain what went well or what didn't, people have a really clear idea of what they need to do to be successful. I think, though, at the end of this, everything we're talking about is just good practice anyway. But I think all of us will go a long way to kind of address the concerns around quiet quitting.
Awesome. And Rachel?
Yeah, believe it or not, I started my career overseas in the Czech Republic as editor-in-chief of In Style magazine. I launched it in the Czech market, and it was a new magazine to the market. It didn't have any history. It was right after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. It was a really uncertain time. And we had quite a bit of turnover in staff at the beginning. It was really hard to get candidates to accept roles that we'd offered them because it was risky for them to leave their current job. One thing I did as a manager that was really effective, and something you can do whether or not you're onboarding a new employee or in these individual meetings with your team, is ask those people that work in your team who you manage what they would like to be doing in the next 5 or 10 years in their career. If you have trust with them and if they answer you honestly, what this is going to allow you to do is to listen in for other opportunities that might come along, projects you might give them a small piece of so that they might help to build skills for themselves in another area of their company. This is going to help keep them safer from layoffs that might be happening, because if someone has more visibility in another team or has learned new skills in another area, they might be able to be moved into that other department rather than being laid off. It's also going to really create a lot of loyalty with you and that person. So when I'm thinking back to the example, Yana Bertram, who now is an international advertising exec, even doing her own things now, she is a powerhouse of an employee. She started as my photo editor at InStyle. And literally her daily job was just getting the photo clearances on all of the photos that we wanted to publish in the magazine. A lot of her job was very, very, very much basic follow-up with emails and project management. But she knew that I had an eye out for other opportunities with her, for her within the marketing team. And so I let everybody know, hey, if you get your basic duties of your job done, I will look for other opportunities for you aligned with where you want to go. And in the case of Yana, she was able to get hired by the marketing team at the publishing company that I worked with. She ended up moving to Italy. She went to business school, and her career has really blossomed. It probably would have anyhow, but I feel so fortunate that I was able to be a player in the story of her success. And the more that you are that person, the more loyalty you will have from all of your employees, especially your younger employees.
I love that advice for everyone. And I just want to share this one thing. So if you've been following me for a while, it's kind of a whiplash segue into another thing, but we've been talking about skills. So if you've been following me for a while, you might remember an article that I wrote about employees getting their workplace skills off of TikTok. And quiet quitting shows the potential that social media can have and is having on changing and shaping the behaviors in your workplace. And so this is one of the reasons that I stress really heavily to everyone that I work with, and other employers, that they invest in upskilling their employees themselves, lest they be forced to pay the consequences for someone else's training. And so this brings us to the close of our session. I want to thank everyone, Rachel, Jessica, Kimone, Ashley, for your time and your wonderful input. Really great conversation. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and hope to see you at the next live session. Thanks for being with us.
And thank you